Episode of FundIndieFilms, and today we have with us Francis Abbey here to talk about his new web series being put on Kickstarter, The Broken Continent.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
All right, so you're obviously doing fairly well with your Kickstarter so far. The Broken Continent has 5 days left.
That's right.
Before the Kickstarter ends, and you've raised $32,000 out of $35,000 goal.
That's right. Actually, at last check, I think it was $32,441. So we're like just a little over $2,500 away from the $35,000 initial goal. So very hopeful we can hit that in the next 2 days or so.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Most Kickstarters that make it this far do succeed, but of course you still need people's help to get past that. Given that you're probably going to succeed with funding, what do you see being the difference if you go over by a larger amount?
Well, the way we have it structured right now, when we've gotten, you have to, I think one of the keys to success with Kickstarter or any crowdfunding effort is to have realistic expectations. So $35,000 was our realistic expectation. And with $35,000, we will be able to produce 15 pages of our 30-page script, because the way we were approaching it was to shoot 30 minutes worth of material and then divide that up into webisodes, so that this would ultimately be a speculative pilot web series. And so with $35,000, we can do half of that script. If we get to $50,000, then we'll have enough money to do the entire script, which will be great because there's a lot of really cool sword fighting and stuff that happens in the second half of the script. But so we had a plan A and a plan B, and plan B being actually the $35,000. So we'll see what, if something miraculous happens in the last 5 days, we will get that opportunity. And it's possible that it could happen. We did have a mysterious $5,000 backer that none of us knew, which was a giant surprise. We weren't really sure that we'd have anybody we didn't know contribute something of that size. So that's pretty cool. And as you said, as you get toward the end there, the campaign really kind of picks up steam. People see it. People find out about it. Kickstarter's promoting it, like things that are quickly approaching the deadline, and there's a bandwagon effect. So yeah, we're looking forward to that.
Yes. So with the Broken Continent, it's a fantasy web series, and sort of what's the story? What's the big driving idea behind the show?
Well, the basic premise, the Broken Continent. To explain that, at one time it was a single massive land called Illyrian, which was sort of an Atlantis-like culture that was very advanced and had people that were highly gifted in the use of magic. And the 55th king of Illyrian, Dumerian, then was so powerful with magic he proclaimed himself to be a god. And Relios, in anger, split the continent into pieces. And so that's where we are now, some millennia later. And the king now of the Heart, which is the largest fragment of the Broken Continent, is attempting to conquer all 5 shards and then unite them under his rule. And so he's an ambitious guy, and not everybody shares his ambitions. So before he sets out to do that, he has to first quell a rebellion in his own backyard, and then he'll move on and try to conquer the other 5 shards. But there are other people besides his lords beneath him that are not fond of this idea and are having to put up with all kinds of refugees and stuff seeking their protection, and that's the Daughters of Tyrol, who are a group of women warriors. I describe them as warrior nuns who reside in the Ironleaf Forest and offer refuge to all kinds of orphans and widows and stuff over the centuries that they've been there. But they've kind of actually faded away into sort of legend, and most people don't believe they actually exist. But they take it upon themselves. They say, look, we can't handle all of these runaways coming in because we're going to run out of food eventually, and we're going to be overrun. So we have to do something about it. So they look to find a way to stop Edwin Redway's march through the heart, and then through the other the remaining shards. So that's the basic premise. It's very epic in scope. We're keeping it a little localized for our pilot. Yeah.
So keeping it localized, a manageable core story that will be its story, but then it leaves places for everything to go. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. We have there's plenty of room for the story to expand and grow afterward. And of course, this being a spec pilot, that's the hope, that we can then get the backing to do additional seasons and be able to expand the world, because one of the challenges going into something like this, especially here we are in the United States, there's no buildings that are really older than a few hundred years, and so castles aren't really sitting around, and so you have to. I had to think, it's like, well, what could we use that's sort of medieval or something that looks like it would be appropriate for a fantasy piece. And so the answer was forests and fields. I mean, that's basically what we could do. Unless we can, then we can get the budget, then we can look into building sets. We can look into doing like more with matte paintings and CGI and everything like that. So, but for the time being, we have to keep it simple. And that's kind of how, that was actually what inspired a lot of this story, because having in the past, I've written for my, within my limitations. In terms of production, so and that's what I did even with this, fantasy piece, where sort of the sky's the limit as far as your imagination goes. But then when you actually are trying to make it, then your budget is the limit, and you have to figure out creatively how to make something good and yet stay within those limits. That's actually the Robert Rodriguez school of filmmaking, which I learned way back when I read. Rebel Without a Crew, and he's like, I knew I had a truck, so I wrote a truck into my my film. That's how it worked. So if you have something, you write it in.
Okay, so cool. I find that having limitations oftentimes forces you to be a bit more creative with things. If you look at say the original Star Wars trilogy, they had a lot of limitations that they had to work with, but because it's like, oh well, we have to figure out a way around this. Sometimes the things that result are much more interesting than if you just have this huge blank canvas that you could spend however much on.
Right.
That's always quite interesting. And now you have to have enough to be able to make it. I mean,
right.
You need to be able to have your costumes,
yeah.
Your swords. You need to be able to pay people to help choreograph everything very nicely.
Right. There is sort of like a dividing line, where there's like just enough money to make it and still have enough creativity to make it very interesting, and then having enough money to do anything, and then like you're sort of crushed under the limitless possibilities. I think that's one of the things that hurt the Star Wars prequels. They're why they're not as beloved as episodes 4, 5, and 6, is that he basically could do anything he wanted, and he did, and that was kind of a bad thing. And then you look at like Jaws is another example where the mechanical shark was not the greatest and everything, so Spielberg had to be much more judicious in his use of the shark, and he ends up making one of the great films of all time. So yeah, your creativity can really help you in those situations, and having all the money in the world is not necessarily a good thing. So it can be, I guess, but it can also be maybe a curse, because I thought that was like, if you again looking at the Star Wars films, Coruscant, it's like a planet that's a city, and it was just, there was so much stimuli in that place, and everywhere you went, I mean, it was just like, let's just cram all of this stuff into one single scene. It was just kind of sensory overload, I thought, for some parts of that.
Well, in some ways, yes, but having seen Red Letter Media's reviews of that and all that, they had all this stuff going on in the background, but they never really focused on how they could use just basic things like camera movements and such in order to actually create a much more dynamic, engaging environment.
Yeah, I guess that's also, yeah, I mean, that's an additional wrinkle. I mean, in those movies, you're not, I mean, I guess we're how many years removed from Revenge of the Sith? 7 or 8 years, I guess. And but even that is like this vast amount of time because or The Hobbit coming out soon. I went back and I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy, obviously a huge influence for this project, and Peter Jackson is definitely right. Peter Jackson is a guy who comes from that same low-budget indie background, had to rely on a ton of creativity to produce his films and everything like that, and used a lot of those tricks for Lord of the Rings. Because even though he had what would probably seem like an incredibly big budget, there was a lot of creative ways to get around problems and make everything look good. And even now, I mean, you go back and you see certain things, and like not that the CGI is bad by any means, but you're kind of like, it's like, oh, that's not as good as I remember, because you've seen better CGI since, because it's constantly improving. And so it kind of stands out a little bit. You're like, oh, that wasn't as good as I thought it was. It's still, the movie's still terrific. But The Hobbit, I think, it'll be weird again looking at The Hobbit and then comparing it to Lord of the Rings, because The Hobbit will have probably superior effects and everything.
Yeah. Well, oftentimes, what I've found is people are willing to kind of overlook, somewhat lesser effects than, the huge big blockbusters. If the storytelling and the way it's presented are really engaging,
right.
And of course on a production like yours, what sorts of techniques are you using to be engaging on your means?
Well, I mean, the first thing is story and character are just the most critical elements. I think your story and character is where it all starts, because I mentioned I mentioned Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, of course, another huge inspiration for what we're doing. And the first thing that you love about those two fantasy stories are the characters and the story, the plot. And if those are strong, I mean, that's your first thing, and then everything else is just enhances that. So that's kind of where we wanted to go, and so I believe we do have some characters that have depth to them, and we're just this is kind of a prologue almost that we're presenting here. So it's not like we're just giving the sort of the opening chapter, the kind of tease for the rest of the story with our pilot. But I think that is the big key. And then we want to have, what we're concerned about is attention to detail as far as costumes and stuff. And when we say that, it's not because we're not bound to have any particular historical accuracy. And that's always our way out. It's like, oh, well, it's a fantasy. We don't have to worry about being completely accurate. Would they have done that in medieval times? It's like, well, it doesn't really matter because it's a fantasy. But we do want to have costumes that look like they have existed in a real setting. And distressing clothes and making clothes look accurate and having good props and all of that, all of those things factor in to the presentation. So because it's when those things take people out of the story that they're a liability. Kind of as you're saying, it's like you'll forgive like lesser special effects and stuff like that, provided that those other elements are very solid. So that's kind of what we're working at. It's like those things, like so much in film, have to be perfect, so they go unnoticed. So that people don't really care. It's like only when things are kind of imperfect do people notice and it comes to their attention, and that's bad when they start nitpicking about things like that, and are not concerned so much with the story or the characters.
I remember being at a concert, and Dale Clevenger, who was performing, mentioned that live music is not perfect. Live music is wonderful.
Yeah.
And so I guess in a lot of ways you're trying to be wonderful rather than polishing everything.
There's truth to that, and I do think that there's an experience to it, when you're talking about live music, I mean that's like there's something about being there and being in the presence of the artists and everything like that makes that experience memorable. And you're right, because I've always preferred the studio albums to the live albums. But yeah, in our case, I mean, especially for this pilot, I mean that's the thing. It's like we're not going to be, we can't replicate the epic scale of Lord of the Rings or of Game of Thrones or anything like that, but we can still make a very good product, and we can have good production values and everything like that, and just kind of work within our own budget to produce that. And like, that's the thing, I don't think people appreciate how much money, like, the amount of money we're asking for kind of seems like a lot, but it's a drop in the bucket when you compare it to like those big budget, like the HBO budget for Game of Thrones or the budget for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and everything. There's just so much money and so many people working on these projects. So, and that's where it all goes. I mean, people, this is their job basically, and they're getting paid. I mean, kind of when we break down our budget, one of the biggest expenditures is paying crew and paying cast and stuff. And we had sort of an argument with, or it was like an online back and forth about doing things for the love of doing it, and that's absolutely true. But if you're going to spend a lot of time and resources on something, then money's sort of a reality. And
if you're going to do a little of something, you can do it for free. But,
right. Yeah.
But if you're trying to keep telling your story to be able to do it as your livelihood, to be able to do it all the time.
Right.
Then that takes money.
Right.
You can make a short film, just get your friends together on the weekend, be done with it.
Right.
But then if you're making a series, well, you can't just do that on one weekend. It has to be all week, every week.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think of Christopher Nolan. He made his first film on weekends, basically, so that they could get around everybody having a day job and stuff like that. And it took him a year to complete his first feature film. And in the same, Robert Rodriguez, I mentioned him once already, but like he sold his body to medical science, and then raised the money to do his film in Mexico. And he says and I would wrap before lunch so I didn't have to feed anybody. And he had all of those tricks, and they're great, but like, we're trying to operate like as professionally as we can, as replicate a professional production, which means paying people, even if it's not to the scale that they're used to being paid, but enough that they are not losing money by like taking time off work or time away from their normal schedule to be a part of our project. And so that's where a large part of that money is. And when you talk about the big, everybody says, like, how could that movie cost so much? But there's a lot of people involved. I mean, you sit in a movie afterward and you see the credits roll by, you see just how many people are involved in something like that, and they all have to make a living wage. So yeah.
Well, I noticed in your, we're talking about doing things on a tiny budget and all that, and I don't want people to get the wrong idea about the project at all, because, quite frankly, your, little couple-minute bit during your campaign video was very impressive. It looked, really professional, and, granted, it was in a forest, but you still had the costumes there. Yeah. And how did you go about getting that look to be really professional?
Well, I guess the two biggest contributors there would be Habib Khan Awan, our director of photography, who shot that, and our costume designer Elizabeth Reeves, who helped put together the costumes. And also, and some of our costuming was provided by museum replicas, which you see there, and Potomac leather, which, wonderful leather coat that our Eben Spider is wearing. And so, I mean, that's what, that we just put those elements together, and we went out there, and we did that, really. I mean, that was just a couple hours worth of shooting with a very small crew. And, I mean, we're going to have a larger crew when we actually go out there to do the real thing. But it's little touches like the tracking shots with the camera, low angle shots. Low angle shots make everybody look big, so those are good. And so I mean, that's what it is, really. It's just kind of studying, going out and what makes a good movie good, and taking notes of like what those things are, and being and critically analyzing films in that regard. It's like, because you learn all of these things, but then there's the subtleties of it. It's like, what a single shot is, what a wide shot is. It's like, but, if you go lower, then suddenly it gives it a more dramatic effect and things like that. So there are those little subtleties. And I won't take credit for all of it. Like I said, it's like Habib came up with a lot of that. Bryant Francis, who helped us out that day, who's a young filmmaker who just moved out to Los Angeles, and good luck to him. But he also had a lot of really helpful input on that day, with doing that. And it was for myself. I've done 2 low-budget comedies prior to this, and it's a lot of talking. There were a lot of scenes where people are sitting around talking. So this is like really the first time that I'm doing something with a lot of action and very carefully choreographed action sequences and stuff. So I said, I have to raise my game as a director, and I've been watching things and taking notes and trying to get ready to get in there and do it.
In the last year, I've started to watch various different things like Hong Kong action films and all that, and been comparing how they shoot their action to big Hollywood films.
Yeah.
And one thing I kind of noticed is a lot of Hollywood films kind of try and cover up their action with like quick cuts and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Hong Kong guys will often use a wide angle lens or a low angle or something to really kind of accentuate the movement.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering if you'd kind of decided on any techniques or whatnot that you were going to try and shoot the sword fights and all that.
Right. It's interesting that you say that, because I'm a fan of the Hong Kong action films. I'm not a fan of where the editing is so much that it's completely manufactured by the editing. The fight is totally a product of the editing, because I like the fight to take place and for that to play out and have the actors actually telling the story. And 2 of my favorite fights on camera, studying this because it's going to be sword fighting heavy. Rob Roy is one, and The Princess Bride is another. And Princess Bride is directed by Rob Reiner, and Rob Reiner's the guy who did This Is Spinal Tap, and he's known for comedy, and of course
Bride.
Right. And The Princess Bride is is also a comedy, but has one of the better sword fights. Right. As one of the better sword fights ever in film, I think, and part of that is because he was wise enough to just kind of hang back, do a wide shot, and let the actor and the stunt coordinator and the stunt fighters and everything like that just do their job, and it's a great scene, and they had a terrific set to be able to go all over and do that fight with. So yeah, that is something, and then Rob Hunter is our fight choreographer, and we actually just had our first rehearsal the other night with 2 of our main characters, or 2 of our characters from the very opening scene, and I mean that was just amazing to be a part of and kind of watch the process. And then in my head I'm thinking, it's like, okay, now how am I going to shoot this, and there are a lot of other considerations. I realize it's not as simple as just just open, stand back and let the camera do its thing. Because you'll notice that in the Hong Kong action movies, which I love, I'm a huge fan of kung fu movies and everything. Oftentimes there isn't as much, storytelling. I mean, to the fight as it is. There will be a plot there, but some of it's just going to be moves for the glory of it, because you can see that's just so amazing. They're trying to give you
the enjoyment of just the motion of it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
It's like a dance.
Right. It is like a dance, and that's fantastic. But I realized when we were doing this, it's okay, so this fight is kind of in 3 different phases, phrases actually.
As you're telling a story.
Right. Yeah. So you're telling a story, and as things are happening, you realize, and on any budget, I said, okay, so this is a problem, because as things, say a shield becomes more and more damaged, you can't we'll have a replacement, but it's not like we have a whole bunch of shields we can just pull out and it's okay, let's retake that and pull out a shield or something like that, and we can't repeatedly damage things and bring them back. It's that's not, we don't have the money to do that. So a lot of it will be, we can't just say, okay, let's just do a master shot of the entire fight, and then we'll come back and we'll do close-ups. It's no, we can't do it. We're going to have to do it in segments, and so it will be, there will be parts of it that are more edited, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's like I said, it's when the editing becomes kind of extreme, and you kind of don't know what's going on anymore. I dislike that, but one of Ridley Scott's early films is The Duelists, and that has some really interesting fights in there, and I really like the opening one. which is a duel involving Harvey Keitel and and another guy. And the way that's shot, I think, is very cool, and it involves a couple of different things. There's some gorgeous wide shots in it, and then there's like some handheld camera work over the shoulder as you see the other kind of the opponent from the over the shoulder of the other person. And there's a lot of really cool stuff in there, and I think that's one where it's an edited sword fight, but it works really well. You never get confused as to what's going on, and you're able to follow it, and it's sort of the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and you were mentioning, the Princess Bride being an example of, he hangs back and basically what I found so awesome about a lot of the Princess Bride was that the fight scenes and stuff didn't overwhelm the story. They were awesome because of the story,
right.
Because you were invested in the characters.
Yeah.
And for instance, with the Inigo Montoya scene, you're really, feeling what that character's going through.
Right.
As that arc, kind of wraps around that final bit.
Yeah.
You're like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he gives his backstory basically because, and it's so wonderfully set up. I mean, first you have the whole funny interplay where the Man in Black doesn't fall off the cliff. And so he has to climb up, and then eventually, he's got the back and forth with Inigo, and he's like, you could do something helpful, like throw me a rope or something. So he throws him or first he tells him, he's like, I don't know if he's like, I'm not sure you trust me. And then he says, it's like, he swears on his father's grave, and that's enough. That convinces the Man in Black. He's like, okay, you can be trusted, because he wouldn't swear on his father's grave if he wasn't serious. So he takes the rope up, and he's about to fight. He's like, no, we'll wait till you're ready. So you see then that Inigo's an honorable guy too. And then they start chatting, and then he asks him about the Six Fingers. So the backstory is revealed, and you get the whole story of the Six-Fingered Man. And so we like Inigo. The Man in Black is this mysterious guy, but he's like very charming and an honorable guy too. So you like him, and then it begins, and then so you get like all these great sequences, and then interspersed is just more story. And then the whole great exchange about like I'm not really left-handed and all that stuff, and then it all builds to the end of that scene. So I mean, it is some terrific filmmaking and storytelling within that entire sequence. And so I mean, I'm a huge fan of that. And then like I said, Rob Reiner was just wise enough to kind of like hang back and let everybody do their job. And of course, William Goldman is the writer, and he in the script he says the greatest sword fight of all time takes place or something like that. That was his direction. That was as much direction, or like his in his script that he gave. So, and it's a very, very memorable scene, I think.
Yes, and so being sort of one of the inspirations for this project kind of gives me a little bit of an idea on where you're trying to take it, and the Broken Continent might have a bit of different tones and all that, but it seems like it's in pretty safe hands as far as making the story and the action and everything kind of blend together.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly the hope. It's sort of I'll confess that the pilot really is a little crammed full of like of stuff. When I talked about it, I said that if we were doing an hour-long show for a season, I said we're probably talking about 5 to 6 episodes worth of things happening in this 30 minutes. But because it's like we have to make this really big impression, that's why I sort of crammed all of this stuff into 30 minutes. And I said we have to kind of we got to hit them hard. It's got to make a big noise. And so that's why it's sort of condensed. The pilot episode is kind of condensed as far as everything that transpires. Yeah.
So be a quick, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, it is. And I think that that might be the way it goes. If we continue to do a web series, I mean, it's going to have to be like that because you want the web. It's a very new way of telling stories and stuff like that, and people watch stuff in 5 to 7 minute segments. So you have to adjust the the pacing of your storytelling accordingly, and so that's something that I'll have to work with. If we're fortunate enough to get to that point, we'll have to see, like, if we're making like maybe 30-minute episodes versus like 5 to 7-minute episodes. It's two entirely different ways of doing it. So,
well, one thing that I've kind of noticed with the web is that in the traditional sort of media, you had very specific sort of containers that you had to make your show fit in.
Yeah.
You could be a feature film, in which case you're 90 minutes to 3 hours.
Right.
You could be a half-hour show. You could be an hour show.
Right.
There really wasn't anything under that half-hour mark.
Yeah.
Unless you're some segment on a half-hour or an hour show.
Right.
And on TV there wasn't really the space for anything much more than an hour.
Right.
And you couldn't, say, do between that half hour and an hour. You had to fit it. You had to kind of squeeze your show or
right.
put some filler into it to make it last that bit. Or you had to go feature film, at which point you can't really do a continuing thing very easily.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's the thing about the web. It really opens it up as far as what you can. There is no limitation as far as like the length of what you're working on. The Guild is a great example of a successful web series, and I mean the length of their episodes ranges from like 5 minutes to like, and I'm not sure how long I sort of saw them in succession on Netflix, but I do think they had some that were like longer, like closer to 10 minutes. And when you're doing episodic television, I mean you are really bound, especially if you're doing stuff on like network or basic cable. Things have to hit at a certain time in order to get your commercials in. HBO, they have a lot more freedom because, I mean, they're still sort of like in that hour, but they can, some will run over an hour a little bit, and they're not bound to like any particular length. So it'll be somewhere between 52 minutes and an hour or something like that when you're talking about HBO, or the premium cable channels. But the web, yeah, and so HBO doing original programming, which is a fairly recent development, and then the web have really kind of changed the way we tell stories in that respect. So
yeah, it's gonna be really interesting to see how your series unfolds, and I'd like to keep up with your series as you kind of go through various stages of your planning and production and editing and all of that, so that kind of people can follow your progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to share with you.
All right. So Francis Abbey, thank you for your time with this interview, and everybody, please check out the Kickstarter page for The Broken Continent.
They can get there, getbroken.tv. Getbroken.tv, that URL will take you directly to our Kickstarter page.
Great. Everybody, check it out. It looks like it's well worth supporting, and there's only 5 days left.